when you look at X, and if you look at Facebook, if you look at all these things, there is no liability. And you know why? Because they're saying, we didn't say it. We're a platform. We don't have to be responsible. We don't have to be accountable. We're not liable for anything. We don't have any real skin in this game. I don't know what we do about that. It's one of those things that genie's out of the bottle.
Yep.
And it's very frightening.
Today's guest is Congressman Charlie Gonzalez, who served 14 years in Congress after his father's 37-year tenure. He shares the personal cost of public service, the rarity of financial integrity in politics, and his fight for consumer protections. We discuss how fundraising laws have reshaped power in Washington, the role of fear and misinformation in today's political polarization, along with how to better spot false narratives. What stood out to me most was his unfiltered take on why true public service means leaving office with your principles intact, even if it costs you financially. Let's start the show. Congressman Gonzalez, I'm so thrilled for you to be on. Thank you so much for joining today. Welcome.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure.
So I want to set the table for everybody, if you'll indulge me for a second, because you have an esteemed career, which we're going to spend the meat of the conversation talking about. I'm going to go through that very briefly. It's going to be a butchered, unrepresentative, unfair representation of your accomplishments. But we're going to get into that a little bit more. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. Then I'm going to launch into a question. So just to set the table for the audience, Congressman Gonzalez has been a representative of San Antonio for whom I interned 20 plus years ago, and comes from a long generation of history. So I want to touch on that. Before I do, a few facts. Congressman Gonzalez has served for 14 years. You served as a judge in different capacities for 15, 16 years or so. You've been successful in your private career, in your legal practice. You served on the Air National Guard. All of these things I want to unpack a little bit further. But before we do, I wanted to talk a little bit about legacy. I became a dad 2 years ago, and your history is fascinating. So I want to start with your grandfather, and then we're going to get to your father. But your grandfather, Don, and correct me if any of this lore is incorrect, but from my research, he owned several silver mines and was the mayor of Mapipi in Mexico. And he was jailed by a revolutionary group and was scheduled to be put to death by firing squad. He ended up escaping and fleeing Mexico to arrive in San Antonio. Is all that correct?
Yeah, it's really an interesting, a lot of wonderful history and lore, all pretty factual actually. But no, he was mayor of a small town called Mapimi, and it's in Durango, and they were very fortunate. As a matter of fact, in that little town, they have a museum, and a lot of they feature him in this. So Leonidas Gonzalez, my grandfather, obviously fled during the Mexican Revolution at the turn of, I guess, 20th century with 1900, early 1900s. And people forget the country was in total turmoil. You could have had 1 million people died in the revolution, but definitely some of the revolutionists were definitely going after the establishment, and there is no doubt that my grandfather was part of the establishment. They owned mines, mostly silver and such, and he, like I said, he was the mayor and so on. He had a couple of brothers. His younger brother was already in medical school down in Mexico City. Long story, but they definitely had imprisoned him, and he was, they took care of people, if you know what I mean. And he was able to escape. The problem was they left everything. They left with nothing, like so many people do today, that weren't in this privileged and professional group in that small town. But they left and they came to the United States, and they came to San Antonio. A lot of people stayed right there in Laredo, right across from the border, because the intention was that they would always return. Always.
Right.
Never gave up that hope. So when they got here, they didn't have anything, and so they had to build. My grandfather was a very learned man, and he started working as the editor of the Spanish language newspaper, La Prensa, which was owned and started by the Lozano family. The Lozano family went on to, uh, you know, actually have the biggest. Just San Antonio was the start, but they ended up in Los Angeles. Opinion, the big newspaper, and that was the Lozano family. I think Monica, the granddaughter, was still heading it for many, many years. So it was an incredible time. But I could show you pictures, and you would laugh. My father was born at a house on Upson Street. That house is still there, and members of the family, my generation and younger, replicated a photograph that was taken there 100 years ago with our grandparents. And it's very interesting because uh, relatives all came to San Antonio. They take this picture, and it's just amazing because it's just not the Gonzalez's, but the McMoons, because my grandmother had Scott Irish blood, and that's another interesting story of the settlement of the Scots and the Irish, many in textiles, many in mining. And so you see this picture, and it's just an amazing thing. 100 years later, there we are on that same porch.
Well, let's talk about that 100 years. So I think that was 1911, if I read correctly, was when he was being held up. Your father was born in San Antonio, if I'm not mistaken, and went on to lead in public office for from 1953 to 1999. So 46 years. Are is that correct? Yes, um, state uh, between state representation and then federal representation. And between you and your father, you've had 51 years in the federal representation world. But for those who don't know, Henry B., your father, has a convention center named after him in San Antonio. So a lot of history. But one thing, there's a few anecdotes that I wanted to bring up, and which are not highlighting
With my father.
his terrific career. But there's one, he was endorsed by mariachi bands, LBJ and Cantinflas, which I find super interesting.
Oh yeah.
Also helped to campaign for JFK and was in the motorcade following him when he was assassinated. But there was a remarkable story about somebody in the restaurant Earl Labels, which is a staple in San Antonio, calling him a communist and him effectively standing up and knocking his lights out. And um, just one word, is that confirmed as correct? Is that a fair assessment of what happened?
And it caused me a lot of heartburn because, and I'll tell you why. This was in the maybe mid 80s, right around there. If I was in my office, I'd bring you the newspaper that had it on there. And well, what happened is my father was having breakfast at this establishment, Earl Abel's, where everyone went for breakfast. And he was there with his chief of staff and the chief of staff's brother, who was on leave from the army. And his chief of staff said, Congressman, that man over there, they keep staring, and he called you a communist, because my father was engaged in a conversation with the older brother who was here on leave. So my old man went up there. I mean, Dad could be very confrontational. I would never do any of the things, but if you ever saw the size of my father's hands, you would understand he could be confrontational. And he was a boxer when he was young, so he could take care of himself physically. He went up and he said, "I hear you have an issue with me or something." And the guy says, "Yeah." And said, "I hear you call me a communist." And then the guy, my dad now is 70. I forget how old he is at that point, 72 or whatever. And this is a man in his 40s. And
Right.
he says, "Yeah." And then the guy really, it was a little bit more. Not only did he call him a communist, but when my father said, "What did you call me?" He says, "Well, if it walks like a duck and quacks." And the old man at that point, now, according to my father, he did not slug him, he sort of slapped him. But according to a friend of mine who represented the individual that got punched, the guy did have a black eye, So, it was terrible. And the reason I say that is, one, my dad should not have punched the guy. But I will tell you now, of all the things my father did with Kelly Air Force Base, with JFK, LBJ, Carter, Clinton, all the things for San Antonio with Brooke Army Medical Center, I don't care what it is, people will come up and say, "Yeah, I was so proud of your dad when he hit that guy," and I want to say, "But aren't you proud when he tried to desegregate the school, when he filibustered for 22 hours against segregation, or on and on?" And it's amazing because people will just attach so much significance to this thing of an older man who was very patriotic, loved his country, and was so insulted to be called a communist. And I used to tell people, God, my generation, you would be called a socialist and communist, and you go, so what? Yeah, yeah, big deal. And it just wasn't, they weren't fighting words.
Right.
My father's generation, those were fighting words. And oh no, that history of that incident, it put me in a very bad position because I was a county court at law judge and I had civil and criminal jurisdiction. Guess what kind of cases I heard?
Those
Assault.
exact same kind. Yeah.
So, everybody, the big joke was, is the case going to be tried by his son? Of course it wasn't. But all my colleagues, they didn't want to be the judge that actually heard that case. It was
Of
very
course.
uncomfortable. That would have been the last thing on my father's mind, is that it created issues for me. But no, that really did happen. Uh, to this day, yeah, it's hard to really defend. You don't raise your. I don't know if you have a son or a daughter.
I do. A son.
Okay, well, if someone insults you or whatever it is, don't resort to violence and things like that, because dad did punch the guy, and it lives him in infamy to this day.
Well, it's such a memorable image to contemplate. It sort of reminds me of, I don't know if you remember when Nolan Ryan was on the mound and a 20-year-old guy came up and started to challenge him, and he just beat the smithereens of it on him on the mound after he'd finished pitching, and it just sort of stands out. It's indelible in your memory. And the reason I bring this up is not to bring up controversial anything or another, or to address how to raise children. I'm actually interested in, those are big shoes. I think there's a common thread among your grandfather, your father, yourself, of action, of diligence, a little bit of an fu mentality. You're going to mess with me. I'm gonna do the right thing. It's something I stand up for and believe in. Um, and so to drive this home, my ultimate question to you is, what do you take away from that history? What responsibility do you think is imbued in your DNA in some way, through what? What can you say about how that influences and shapes your perspective, both of your personal life but your public life as well?
Well, the first about public service, because my dad, all my life, I was born in 1945. So dad was in politics starting in 1948. He actually lost his first race. It was around 1948, 1950, right in there. He lost his first race for the state legislature. People forget. And so that was a lesson in and of itself, is don't give up. Because then a short time later, in the early 50s, he becomes a city councilman and he champions things that had never been championed before. Because we elected the city council at large, and so you didn't have Latinos, representation. But he did. He really, the first thing he wanted to do was integrate our city swimming pools and things like that. I mean, this is crazy, right? But hey, 1954, Brown versus school board, things were happening. Uh, so he always really was a champion for the people that weren't accorded equality, which were minorities, black and brown at that time. So you learn that, but also, sacrifice was uh, that public service consumes you. I always tell young people that want to run for, public service. I said, "Are you willing to sacrifice your family?" And they think
Hmm.
I'm. And I go, "If you want to do that job right, you will be a great public person. You're probably going to be a pretty bad personal family, man
Hmm.
or woman, because it's just all consuming. And we all sacrificed. There were eight of us, eight kids, and mom, poor mom, had all that responsibility. But what you learn is the value of family and how you need family to support you 100% in whatever your endeavor is. But dad made public service like, you know, the highest calling there could be, second to becoming a priest, right?
Right.
And you just grow up in that environment. All of us did. All We knew what we were giving up, but it was worth it because what Dad was doing was seeking justice and opportunity and trying to right wrong. Dad was, the quintessential Don Quixote, man. I mean, he really was. But he brought down some big windmills and things no one ever said or thought could ever be done. So you're just around it. You can't help absorb it like osmosis or something. This thing about justice and how much injustice that there is, how much greed, how much lack of compassion. And so you just really believe that you're part of it, whether you want to or not. You're part of this man's vocation because you're family. You're a son, you're a daughter, you're a wife,
Right.
a husband, to this endeavor, and it's a crusade. I mean, it's exciting. And I was the right age, though, Marcus. I got to travel to Austin with my father, which was only 78 miles north of San Antonio, when he was in the state senate, which to me are the glory days when racism was in your face, man. I mean, and the way he was treated as the first Latino elected to the Texas State Senate, you have no idea the disrespect and how they would belittle. I mean, this was really horrible. But the brave things they did to uh, State Senator Chick Kaysen, the Lebanese American, the Lebanese, the Jewish community, they all lived in the same poor part of town. They were minorities. So they're not going to live
Right.
in a nicer part of towns. And so it was amazing because uh, the European Jewish families that came, the Lebanese families that came, they all spoke Spanish. It was just because they were raised in the West Side too. But Rayo, of course, he spoke Spanish. But for Chick Kaysen, and his nickname is Abraham, but they called him Chick. I saw my dad filibuster on the floor of the state senate against segregation, and they won. I mean, they really were able to defeat like 6 out of 8 segregation bills. So I don't know. I mean, you just go and you respect it. Now, whether you're going to follow in one's footsteps, and I will tell you now, anybody viewing or listening, if you choose a political life, you should not make a lot of money because public service doesn't pay very well. Oh, a congressman gets 174,000. People think that's a lot, but I can just tell you when you have 2 places to live and so on. The Texas State Legislature, I forget what they used to make, $4,700 a year. They met every 2 years. So there is no money. My dad always said, if you leave public service with more money than you had when you entered public service, you probably should have been indicted. I mean, he really,
Hmm.
because there is no way you can really financially benefit. You should not. And if you do, then something's wrong. So, here it is. It's like a priest, the oath of a vow of poverty almost. But it was just so noble. And I don't want to make it like a holy calling of some sort, but it is incredible. So, you're just around it and you're excited by it and you're so proud of him. And it's a sacrifice because you don't see him. I used to go, everybody would come up to me and says, "Oh, your dad was at my son's baptism. Your dad was at our wedding. Your dad was at this other funeral. Your dad threw out the first ball at the baseball thing. Your dad," and I'd be with my brothers and we'd go, "So that's where he was," but we didn't see it. And I've got it. But there are tremendous stories when you come from a political family. So we're young, and I've got my younger brother Stephen, who's just a wonderful kid, and my little teensy brother. I call him teensy. He was, and we would go up and put we would put signs up. In the old days, this was a wooden stake with a sign, and you bang them in, or you would try to find a tree. And this is way back. And we were over here in the southeast side of town, and it had been a long day, man. But we saw this corner house with a big tree on the corner. You could put two signs on there, and everyone would see them. And you would go up and you would ask the owner of the house if you could put the signs up. And so we go up there, and I'd always get my little brother Stephen to do all the asking because he was just a gutsy kid. And he'd go, "Excuse me, sir, what's your name?" And he's, "Oh, that's my name, Mr. Jones." So, "Well, Mr. Jones, we're putting signs up for Henry B. Gonzalez for the state senate or Congress, whatever it was at the time." And he says, "Well, you guys out here in the hot sun putting these signs up for this man? You must really believe in him." And we said, "Well, yes, sir. Yes." We didn't want to tell him he's our dad. "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Well, I'm going to let you because you're working and you're sweating out here." I said, he says, "I bet you that son of a bitch ain't paying you nothing." And we all looked at him. We said, "Sir, that's true. He is not paying us anything." It was all the stuff you run into is hilarious, man. I mean, but in politics, because then when I run, and this is true for everyone that's listening, if your parent was in politics, you will inherit only half of his friends. You will inherit all of the enemies. That's just the way it is. So you start fine.
I want to unpack that a little bit because that was a big question. How do you address that? How do you differentiate yourself? Because those are big shoes to fill for somebody who's left such a mark on your hometown. How do you navigate that? How do you make inroads with those relationships?
Oh, it's really, really hard. And when I served in Congress, now when I was a judge, there was always some offspring of a former judge who followed in their father's footsteps or their family, and that was just kind of understood. But man, Congress was different. But there were many members, not many, but Lucille Allard, Roy Ball Allard, her father was one of the two or three Latinos when Dad got there.
Mm-hmm.
So there were others, Lacey Clay, a bunch of them, and we used to sit there and trade stories. Hey, well, how do you handle this? How do you handle that? And we all had the same stories, and it was just tough because you live in the shadow of someone who was in Congress for 37 years. I was already 54 years old. I'd had a career as a judge, but this is something I thought I would do. Dad's health deteriorated, and it still was there, this noble, wonderful, crusade. And, but it was tough. And we all had the same story. And that was everyone expected you to be like your father or your was in Congress, right? And it was just really, really hard because, Dad raised us to be independent. Until you're independent, then it's like when you're raising your son, you got to have your own mind. And then when they don't do what you like, you go, "How can you do that?" Anyway, so the same thing with adult children that are in Congress. But you were always judged, and people would tell you, "I'm so disappointed. Your dad. Oh, they're just these stories that." But all in all, Dad, we just had different ways, Marcus. I always believe process determines the end product. And I was a product of the judicial system where there's a lot of order and everyone's heard. Then you go to Congress and whoa, not everyone gets heard. Who's ever in the majority? If you're in the minority, they can do anything to you. You can't do anything. But I still believe that you work within the system. Dad was a lone wolf, man. He was so independent. He wasn't the biggest team player ever, because I think he always felt he might have to compromise.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to reconcile all of that. And it's really tough. Just not me, but other offspring, the Udalls, for instance. we would sit there and go, "Oh yeah, man, yeah, your dad, he really caused a lot of hell when that." Well, your dad, and we were never going to be real hell raisers or anything. We had our own, but I mean, it just all these stories. But the worst part was when you were campaigning, and people would just they would even start comparing you there. And my father had a photographic memory. If he met you today, and 20 years later, he would tell you not just who you are, but what you talked about and what you were wearing. I mean, it's scary. I didn't have that. So when I'm campaigning, people would come up and they say, "I voted for your father and I want to support you." So I'd have my little pad out, and I said, well, "What is your name?" "Well, my name is Joseph Sanchez." And I'd be writing down, and they would say, "Your father never had to write it down." I mean, oh man,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, whoa. Um, but I wasn't the only one. I mean, and I don't mean to take up so much of your time, but I got to tell this one story because it wasn't just me that was getting stomped on in comparison to our fathers. So my father hated NAFTA. The last thing he took off the wall when he left Congress in 1998 was a bumper sticker that said, "Vote for NAFTA, be sorry ever after." I mean, he hated it. I wasn't that way.
Yeah.
I was a free trader. I was all those things that Dad wasn't because I believed differently about some things. If it was done right, plus other countries are developing and we're going to have to deal with that. So, anyway, there is another free trade agreement, and it's the Clinton administration. The Secretary of Commerce is Bill Daley, Mayor Daley's son, the most
Hmm.
union man that has ever lived. Chicago, we're talking heavy duty. That's real labor. San Antonio unions are like, this is Texas, man. And I was catching hell from the unions. Bad. I mean, really bad. Horrible. Everybody. Jimmy Hoffa Jr., everybody. They hated these trade agreements. But Clinton needed the support, and I told him I would. So Clinton called and says, "What can I do, man? Y'all guys are catching hell. I want to be helpful." I said, "Well, I've got to meet with the AFL-CIO, the Labor Council, in about 2 weeks, and they're going to eat me alive." And so he says, "I'm going to send my Secretary of Commerce down to San Antonio to appear with you." And I thought, oh, Daley, Secretary of Commerce, will be there with the union. I'm saved. So we go to the union hall and it's packed. I'm telling you, it's packed. And the union guys aren't polite. They tell you what they're feeling. And it's wonderful because they're really great people. And so we're there and we're telling them all the benefits of this free trade agreement. And they are not happy, man. They're not hearing what they want to hear. So then we say, well, let's take some questions. And I'm going, oh, God. Daley will answer them all. He's in the cabinet. He's Mayor Daley's son. This is good. I'll be okay. And so that one hand goes up, and it's this one union leader whose nickname was Creeper. That should tell you a lot.
Yeah.
So Creeper Elizondo. And I look at Creeper and I know this guy's going to tear into us, man. And I said, "Creeper, you got a question?" And he gets up. "No, I've got a statement." He says, "Your father would have never voted this way." Oh. And everybody's going, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And then suddenly, it's like this light bulb goes off. I could see the light bulb going off in Creeper's head. And then suddenly he goes like this and he points a finger at Secretary Daley. He says, "And neither would your father." And I thought, yes. Fast forward, AT&T was headquartered here. Bill Daley leaves the Clinton administration, and he becomes a big AT&T executive. And he's here in the office. I go up to see him when he's visiting, and I said, "Well, how are you doing?" He says, "Fine." I said, "Well, welcome back to San Antonio." And he says, "How can I ever forget San Antonio? I remember that union meeting with you." It was wonderful, man. So you have these moments, but it still was very difficult because It is definitely a vote that my father would not have cast. And was my father right? Was I right? You know, the longer, it's the old thing about the more years on earth, it's amazing how much your parents were right. You know what I mean?
Right.
The whole thing about the older you get, it's amazing how much smarter your parents get, and and I question some of that stuff now, where, the abuses of the system, but it's really tough. Your parents an inspiration. It's like if your parents a school teacher, you value the profession. You might be a teacher. Politics is can be very addictive, and so you have that. But it's a battle. I mean, it's a and a lot of people expect you to be exactly as your parent, and you can't be. I mean, you just can't, and it's okay. I don't think my dad ever thought it was okay, but what can I say?
I wanted to ask. So I'm trying to remember the phrase. John Meacham, who's a historian and writer, talks about the portrait test for politicians. So, which is effectively you walk down the halls and you see these photographs of Lincoln or Clinton or whomever, and what phrase would you attribute to that person? What did they stand for? So, you know, Lincoln would be the Gettysburg Address, for example, and what he did in the Civil War. And um, you try and use that as a well. One, I don't mean to offend, and I don't think it's a negative thing, but I think a lot of politicians have some vanity in there, and I think the vanity can actually serve a very productive purpose, being what side of history do I want to be on? And so, looking back on that, I think one thing that stands out when you're talking about your dad voting to change the segregation rules, that's the right side of history. Time will tell. So even if you vote on something, things get morphed, they turn into something different later on. And in that vein, I wanted to sort of bring your experience in Congress to sort of what the state of affairs are now, because from my recollection, there's always been division among the polarization of parties. But I think today's world seems the chasm seems far greater. There's a lot more tribalism. There seems to be less common ground. I've read multiple interviews of you referencing a lot of productive meetings and fond relationships with those on the other side of the aisle. What do you think has changed, and what do you think people are missing now?
It's real strange. And you said something about ego, vanity, and legacy. Uh, you got to believe in yourself, first of all.
For
And
sure.
this is brutal. I mean, look, you got to, even when I was a judge, I mean, you get reversed. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. But you're not in the public eye being pummeled,
Sure.
your intentions being questioned, your motives being questioned, your ability, your competency, your intelligence. I mean, people come down. I mean, it's bad, man. And so you have to have a healthy ego. Otherwise, you don't have any confidence. You have to have confidence. And you have to have a North Star. You always have to remember, no matter what the obstacle, you know that there is a destination point that stands for justice and equality and truth. And everybody is trying to distract you. I guarantee you, everyone's telling you
Hmm.
it would be so bad. And it's not the perfect bill, uh, piece of legislation, but it will, on the whole, be beneficial. And so you just don't vote no or whatever it is. I mean, you have to really weigh the pros and the cons. When I started in 1999, you know, we were in the minority. Of the 14 years that I was there, only 4 years was I in the majority. And it was the only time I felt really empowered later. But in the beginning, 1999, I was in the minority. But you had wonderful Republican chairs of committee,
Hmm.
which I sat. I mean, uh, Jim Leach, Iowa, incredible man. Now, he just passed away. Anyone watching this, read his obituary. Read the story in the New York Times or the Post or whatever, or who this man was as a Republican. And you're going to say, he was a member of the Republican Party? You're not going to believe it. Mike Oxley from Ohio. Great. I mean, I look back as fondly on that with on my service on their committees with as much fondness as when it was a Democratic chair. That's incredible.
Hmm.
Because when we took the House back, now we're looking at 2006, the world was starting to change, really change. And then, of course, we got wiped out in 2008, and Obama comes in. Uh, I think, let's see, the 4 years I was there, 2004, we took it, 2006, we maintained it, 2008, 2008, 2006, 2008, and then 2010 came and it was over. What is missing? What happened? And why did things get so polarized?
Hmm.
It's almost like you see the demarcation point with the election of Obama. And I don't know why it struck so much fear in so many people that they were being displaced, replaced. And there were a couple of writers that made reference to that. That if you saw Obama, that was actual, in your face, America is changing.
Hmm.
All of a sudden, man, there was insecurity and fear. And people preyed on it. And the only way they could win is to to fan those flames of dissension and discord and fear and insecurity. And you had the Tea Party come in. You got to start. People forget how all this. It's Tea Party and redistricting, of course, which you know you get primaried out. That's the problem.
Hmm.
Redistricting, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, the Republicans are the greatest abusers of the system. I'm not saying Democrats are saints about things, but how they corrupted the process. So when that came on, it no longer allowed Republican members like the ones that I just referenced.
Yeah.
They weren't going to survive in the leadership roles anymore. Even John Boehner didn't even fit in at the end. John Boehner, and I have the greatest respect for John Boehner, Speaker Boehner, and he treated me decently. It never would have happened again. And so
Right.
what will happen? Fear and insecurity, and what the Republicans thought. Oh, well, this is great. We'll regain the majority. We'll get the Senate back. We'll cripple Obama and everything else. Um, what they didn't realize is the old thing, the story of riding the tiger, and he devours everything and clears the path for you, but you can never get off because the
Right.
tiger's going to eat you. And the Republican Party got eaten by the tiger. So that's where we are today. They
Is
can
that tiger you're referring to the Tea Party? Are
Tea
those were the
Party
seeds?
and
Yeah.
extreme right.
Right.
Never in a million years, even some of the more established Republicans that thought, well, of course we're going to utilize the Tea Party anger and energy and organization. What they didn't realize what it was spawning.
Yeah.
And that's where we are today. Uh, Redistricting has a lot to do with what has happened. In the Senate, it's different, of course, because, those are two senators for every state, no matter what. But it's really quite sad to see where it is today. Everything became a political message. Everything became part of an extended campaign to regain the majority, maintain the majority, win the presidency. And the other thing, and I hate to go on this thing, but because people just their eyes glaze over when you start talking about these things. They took things out of regular order. In other words, it was a piece of legislation. It goes to the appropriate committee of jurisdiction. It starts off with a subcommittee, then it goes to the full committee, then it goes to the rules committee, then it ends up. So the only you're so overwhelmed as a member of Congress, you're only really relevant and legitimate when there's a bill in your committee because you're charged with having more knowledge than the other members of Congress. You're
Right.
charged with, you should know more than 380 or 390 other members of Congress. That's your responsibility. That's what you owe your colleagues. It's all gone. Uh, and just okay, the grievances in 2008. That's the first thing. And overall, you start thinking in terms of these fears and anxieties and how do you reverse all that? Well, you go backwards, to a time that people believe they felt more secure, more relevant, not fear of being replaced. I think it's called Make America Great Again.
So actually that's interesting you bring that up because that was something I was thinking about, which is that the way we in the 50s and 60s there were three networks. There was one newspaper that you read locally that was sort of the standing um, tower of truth that you abided by. Fast forward to today's world where there are hundreds of pieces of information being digested through an innumerable number of media sites, all being interpreted, diced in different ways, spun. I get a little bit frustrated with both sides and how they present things so definitively. Which I get, there needs to be some strength behind their statements, but you can take basically any statistic and spin it by highlighting certain aspects of those statistics to a certain light and spin it one way or the other. And I guess I'm just to boil this down, I'm curious how you would advise today's voters to sort of take into account where the truth lies. And I'll just preface it by saying I think a lot of people don't don't take the responsibility seriously of educating themselves. They might read headlines, they might witness a news clip either through YouTube or on what might be questionably called a news network. But the reality, and I'm not, I don't want to mean to be touching a hot, a touchy subject, but even the Hamas Israeli war has centuries of history. And so to encapsulate it in these little tidbits is unjust to the people who have been impacted for centuries by the history that's gone through that. So the reason I bring that up is, you know, when we're faced with making a decision on not just who to vote for, but especially in California, where we have multiple props, where we're having to vote on individual items of legislation, which I have a separate opinion on. What do you think should be the governing principles in how we assess the information, how we vote? Some people vote with their heart, some people vote on their wallet, some people vote on their security. Do you have comments? Because, and you mentioned something earlier that I want to just touch on. This is important. I want you to talk about this. So don't shy away from this, because I think your experience of being in the judicial system and the legislative system, you've seen the sausage, how the sausage is made. It's rare to have access to somebody with that level of insight. And I think it's really important, not just for me, but for the people who are listening and watching to this, to take into account how somebody who's been on the inside would advise those having to vote, which is all of our responsibility.
You have to fact check today, okay? Let me. I'm going to start with what I believe is the basis for arriving at the truth. As a lawyer, I know this for an absolute fact. It's human nature, so we know this, and the law has to make sure that we take human nature into account. So, what instills responsibility? What instills accountability? And it's very simple: liability.
Mm.
No consequence to not telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Misinformation and disinformation, no consequence. The legal system can't touch you. But if you're CBS, NBC, the traditional New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, that is legacy media that still gets sued.
Mm-hmm.
Print something that they know is not true, or they're malicious. We have that area of law. When it comes to the internet, we got it wrong at the very beginning. We thought in order to flourish to make it really available to all the people, not just to digest it or as a source of information. Everyone can be a source of information. We shield them from liability. You're not going to, I can go online, say all sorts of stuff. Uh, and it, now just Charlie Gonzalez doing it, no one's going to notice. But if I have a platform,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's Twitter, I say Twitter just because I know Elon Musk probably hates it when he's a deal that he cut with Twitter. When you look at X, and if you look at Facebook, if you look at all these things, there is no liability,
Right.
anything. And you know why? Because they're saying, we didn't say it.
Well,
We
there's anonymity too.
put this message out there.
Yep.
We're a platform. We don't have to be responsible. We don't have to be accountable. We're not liable for anything. We don't have any real skin in this game. We can promote falsehood day in and day out. What are you going to do about it? I
Right.
didn't say it, It was Charlie Gonzalez, some guy from Bexar County, San Antonio. We just posted it. I don't know what we do about that. It's one of those things that genie's out of the bottle,
Yep.
and it's very frightening. And every survey, you know this, every survey will tell you that the majority of Americans get their news from where? Social
The
media.
internet. Yeah. Social media. Yeah.
Media. It just, and when I got to Congress in 99, since about 94, working its way up, the World Wide Web. What is this? This internet. What is that? Digital. What does that mean? I mean, it was developing. We didn't even have smartphones, right? And for a long time, we just had beepers. They would, time for a vote.
Right.
And then
Right.
all of a sudden, this thing called BlackBerry. Oh my gosh, man, BlackBerry! Can you believe we have Blackberries? Fast forward just a few years. We don't have to go that many years. The smartphones were everything changed.
Yeah.
What is Facebook? What the heck is that, man? What is this Twitter? And I was on a great committee, telecommunications and energy subcommittee. I wish I could have stayed on it because that was the beginning. I was there at the beginning of all this when maybe we could have had a different structure of some sort that would have instilled greater responsibility from these individuals. And then things got monetized because you can't just give everything for free. So you have the profit thing in there. But how do we dial it back? I wish I had an answer other than you change the laws and you can resort to the courts, but we'd be overwhelmed. Courts couldn't handle
Sure.
all this stuff. So I just think is that you've got to find your most legitimate and credible sources of information. And I would say start with people that can get sued for what they say.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice.
To me, it sounds crazy, right? And so, very conservative publications, it can be the Wall Street Journal,
Sure.
or it can be the New York Times, or it can be the networks. I will tell you, some of the best is always going to be public broadcasting system, and it's going to be the NPR. I mean, they really are. I mean, people would say, "Oh, those are just liberal or whatever it is," but you listen carefully, they'll have a counter narrative by someone. They'll always introduce something, but sometimes, I mean, how do you? This is weird. How do you have a counter? I mean, if it's just flat lie, how do you justify it? How do you? We used to have every year they used to give a little prize like for the best joke based on something that happens on the floor. And Joanne Emerson, God bless her soul, she had the best joke one year. This is years and years and years ago, and it was a joke at that time. So the joke is real quick. I'll tell you. So she's at one podium on the House floor, and the opponent is on the other side. And the other side is just misrepresenting everything. Lie, 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 lie. So Joanne, she made this up. Joanne says, "I'm sorry, I can't take this anymore. You are just lying." And the other member of Congress says, yes, I know that, but hear me out. We are today. Hear me out. And it doesn't
Yeah.
matter what you say. It's really scary though. I mean, my wife and I have this conversation all the time. She's a seventh grade language arts teacher. You got the kids, and that, I mean, it is addictive. And I guess maybe I'm just lucky that here at the tail end of my lifespan, I enjoyed, you know, finding truth a lot easier than it is today.
I think there's a lot of great advice in there. Something you touched on, which I wanted to take in a different direction, was a little responsibility, and then we can start to wrap this up because I know we're coming up on time. But one thing in my research I found was that you had a constituent that was a former Mexican turned U.S. citizen, Army veteran that would bring checks to your office to help retire the national debt. And in that reference, you mentioned that is why they are called the greatest generation. And I think inherent in that is it was God, duty, country in some different order, but I don't find that same unity or responsibility to the country, some duty to your fellow citizen or neighbor as prevalent now in today's world. What do you think changed? Is there any way to get us back that you see?
If you think about it, when we're confronted with a crisis that doesn't recognize regions, political parties, races, ethnicity, you would think a common enemy will bring us together.
Right.
I thought the pandemic was going to do that.
Yeah.
Think about that. If the pandemic didn't do that, do you really think you can come as a nation? And we should have done a lot better with the pandemic. But people forget it was the unknown, and
Sure.
we lost 1.2 million people or whatever. This is crazy. But suddenly, you're infringing on my freedom. I understand that people don't want to wear masks, they don't want to get vaccinated, but there was no sense of, well, maybe we do that for the greater good. It's a precaution. Now, if you have a religious objection, I understand that too. A lot of people didn't have a religious based objection. It was really more political. It was the weird
Hmm.
thing. And people found a way to even take that issue and divide us. That is crazy. And now you think for 1 second, short of a foreign nation coming on our soil, what will unite us? I don't know
Right.
anymore. I have no idea. A sense of community? Oh gosh, no. I mean, we take pride in being different. Uh, we don't look for what we have in common. It's what how are we so different? I mean, California catches hell for everything, right? Texas doesn't want to be a California. California doesn't want to be a Texas. But if you really thought about it, we have a lot of things that we should cooperate with across state lines. The thing with immigration is insane. Look at it. So I don't have that answer, Marks. I don't, and I do think, and I've been blessed. Let me tell you, there's been some challenges in my life. There's been some heartache. There's been tragedy. There's been all of that. But all in all, I feel real fortunate. And I'm wondering how many people really feel that fortunate. We live in a grievance society. The
Hmm.
is half full, man. It is half full. And I'm trying to figure everyone is angry. Everyone has a grievance. No one is responsible for it. It's the other guy. Until we
You're
have
right.
leaders that come out and you see the leaders come together and say, we've got these differences, but we are going to compromise. We're going to negotiate. We're going to come out with something. Neither side just romps on the other and prevails 100%. It's give and take, and we come out with something that benefits as many people regardless.
Yeah.
Where do we have? Who are they? I'll just say it. It definitely is not someone of Trump's nature. By his very
Right.
nature, he isn't. built that way, you know. And this is really scary. I mean, it's really, really frightening.
Well, and this will be the round out the questions on politics specifically. But you had mentioned in one of these interviews, you had alluded to the consequences of Citizens United, and I'm curious if you see ripple effects from that still. If you think that there's any repercussions that rooted for that. And what got me thinking about this was when you mentioned the pandemic, which is there is no question the number of deaths that were associated with um, COVID specifically, but there were underlying issues in a large number of cases, that being obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. And it seems to me like that would be the number one thing to protect our national security, our future GDP, is to protect the health of its citizens. And I find it so fascinating and frustrating that our government isn't doing more to help without taking rights away, but at least incentivizing healthier lifestyles, healthier behaviors to help the productivity of our own citizens. And maybe I'm off on that, but I'm curious if you have any feedback.
And then I'm trying to write some things down real quick. Citizens United is the most poorly reasoned judicial decision in the history of the United States.
If I can interrupt, would you mind just clarifying what that is for the audience who may not
Citizens
remember?
United went and recognized basically that money is speech. So don't infringe on free speech, whether it's the individual spending gazillion bucks or whether it's a corporation. And as lawyers, we understand the reason you're a corporation is to insulate yourself from personal liability so that you can create jobs. It was never intended to really make you the same as an individual.
Right.
In fact, it's the total opposite. But nevertheless, I want people, oh, what year was it? Was it 2010? And I think it was the State of the Union. Yeah. And when President Obama talks about Citizens United that had just been decided, and he tells you what's going to happen, and you have Alito shaking his head no. I'd love to see if Alito's still shaking his head no, because money corrupts. And what it opened up, now you just saw what happened this past election. How can one individual give 140, 150 million dollars? But this has been going on, and it's been on steroids. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
the money that goes directly to the candidate that you can limit, but it goes to the super PACs. And
Mm-hmm.
you have money. Money is power. But what if the medium of getting the message out is no longer just three networks and three major newspapers or something? And what if the same people with all that money control the medium? Where do you think we're going? This is, I mean, it's absolutely frightening. On health, yeah. First of all, if you had a pre-existing condition of some sort, or if you were over the age of 62, 65, the virus will probably kill you, right? Uh, and we should have concentrated on that, and we did actually. I mean, who do you think were on all the ventilators and such? But bad, I mean, really terrible health style. I mean, why do we, when we were finally trying to get just full disclosure on the contents of food, how that translates to different
Mm-hmm.
fats, sugar, calories, and stuff. That was monumental. You have no
Mm-hmm.
idea how hard that was. Just find it. When you go and you try to talk to people about healthier menus, we don't want to shut down a business. They don't want a healthier. People don't get addicted to salads.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. So once you have unlimited amounts of money, and then the same people that control the media, and then those are the ones that dictate policy nationwide, but it starts off local, goes to state, then national, and you have a business model that is endangered or in jeopardy. I sell food that doesn't do a darn thing for you health wise. As a matter of fact, it's really bad for you. But you do create jobs.
Mm-hmm.
It's a moneymaker. And so, guess what? All that money, the way you communicate, the way you advertise, you're never going to be successful pushing back on these things. And it's up to the individual consumer. But consumers really believe that if if you can sell this over the counter, it must be okay. Don't
Right.
you think? Right? That's when government says it's not okay. You don't like government. Barney Frank always said government is just another name for the people. And if somehow, if you got it out there and this was about a message from the people, government, true. But we've got all the scientists and all the dietitians and everything else telling you that this is really bad for your family.
Mm-hmm.
Diabetes, I don't have to tell you in the Latino community, it's it's an epidemic. Uh, and it's really scary. But and that was the other thing too is members of Congress have to be willing to lose their office
Mm-hmm.
by taking a stand and doing the right thing. Well, I don't see that anymore. I
Do you have any take on term limits?
term limits, my father was there 37 years. I was there 14 years, 51 years. Of course, John Dingell and his father were there probably 75 years. And then his wife took the seat, so that probably can be 100 years in the Dingell family. As long as the voters want to send you back, and what's the big advantage to incumbency? It's not that anymore. It's how things have been redistricted.
Yeah.
It doesn't give people an opportunity to vote for someone that might have a broader view of policy. That takes a lot, that is just playing to that majority in order to survive the primary.
Yeah.
Uh, you can't do that. I mean, I, I just, I'm not at a loss for things, but what are we going to do? We could do something about Citizens United, by the way. Congress can.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. They're not going to do it. Redistricting. Supreme Court said you can gerrymander for political advantage. I mean, get real here.
Yeah.
And that's what scares me. I have one last thought. We've always survived because there's a branch of government that was really independent, and as long as you abide by their ruling and their decision, and that was the judicial branch, which is I have a real affinity for it. But I think the judicial branch in the United States and the federal system has been co-opted, and you have so many appointees that are really almost like political operatives, and that is the most frightening thing to me in the twilight of my years.
So I'll bring this in for a close here, and I'm going to sort of tether two questions together. But I've heard several listeners find these conversations very inspirational, but there are a couple that are in their third and fourth quarters of life who have said it's so inspiring, but I don't know, I wish I was younger to take advantage of it. And as somebody who's got a lot of seasoning and is highly, highly productive, you're on the cusp of being 80, correct?
Oh, yeah, Cinco de Mayo.
Cinco de Mayo, and you have remained very productive, very engaged. What advice do you give, not to younger people, but to people in the second half of their life trying to identify purpose and meaning and drive? What advice would you give to those people? And I know I'll just end it there with you left Congress 12 years ago. And you've been as productive on those last 12 years as you were preceding that, maybe hopefully with a little bit more sleep and less travel. But how did you navigate that off ramp, and what advice would you give for those people?
Well, you bring something up that's very, very interesting. Because I just had a conversation with someone who's my age who said, "Please, you know, I can't." I introduced him to someone this morning who runs an organization, and he said, "Please, I can't help. I know we said something about exchanging my contact information. I don't want him to drop out, but he's dropping out. Okay, because
Hmm.
so much time. I understand that. And to all the people that you just described, don't drop out. There's still something you can do. Find that one public official that you know is honest and hardworking and sincere, and you can tell who they are, how they respond to your communication when you go to the town hall meetings. Uh, One thing as you get older, there's a little more wisdom and you can judge character. You're invaluable by your mere life experiences. You're bringing something to the table that a younger person doesn't have. It's not the younger person's fault. So my plea to them is don't drop out. You have wisdom. You have experience. Uh, you can share some of that, but be supportive. Contribute $5, contribute $10. I know you're going to get a lot of solicitations, it's going to drive you nuts, but be part of that. Put that sign up, put that bumper sticker still. The social media stuff now, guess what? You can be an influencer. It's scary, isn't it? But you really can. And there are people that will help you with all that. They're going to be younger because they understand. I can't even, deal with my iPhone anymore. It's gotten so complicated. But don't give up. Keep up with the technology as much as you can. I have friends that will not text. I mean, that's,
Sure.
uh, but you still have so much to give. And if you don't give it, then all of the younger generations will have to make the same mistakes we did. Why do they have to learn by making mistakes? So that's what I would tell them. Uh, you're still valuable. But you're only as valuable as your involvement. You
Yeah.
know, and I will say this: if you don't challenge your mind every day, if you don't read and keep up, bad things will happen to you,
Hmm.
and you don't want that. You can live many more years in real great health if you stay engaged. So if you don't do that with the politicians or whatever, do that with friends and your family. Keep your mind active. Get out of the house. Get out of the house. Turn the television off. Force yourself to go over there with your silver sneakers at the local YMCA. Do it. And I'm telling you, you will be a better person and a happier person.
That's great advice. Um, any closing words? Any last thoughts? Anything you think I may have missed?
Yeah, just not to forget the nation that we are, and people are trying to put a whole different spin on, uh, that we're going to make America great again. I mean, since when has America not been great? Being a bully doesn't make you great. Might makes right is not a good formula or whatever. Let's go back. And our country was so imperfect from the beginning, and the founding fathers knew about how imperfect it was. And
Hmm.
that we are an experiment and we continue. We're not that old, but we have to improve. We can't go backwards. Uh, and don't be so fearful of being replaced and displaced because there are changes out there. Welcome change, that which improves our lives, and start thinking in terms of your fellow citizen as someone that you share the same aspirations. You want good health, you want financial security, you want a safe neighborhood, you want all these things, and we can all have them. It doesn't mean that someone's success somehow is means failure for you. It's
Right.
not black and white. It just isn't that. Uh, but in the spirit of community again, but to stay involved somehow, just keep going, keep remain. Just like I say, the magic word to me is engagement and activities and keeping your mind going and knowing that you still have a contribution to make. You're never ever ever too old.
This is wonderful. Congressman, thank you so much for being on. This has been one of my favorite conversations. I
Oh,
really
well, no,
appreciate it.
thank you very much for taking the time, and I'm sorry if I go over some of this
This
stuff.
was terrific.
All
It
right.
was terrific. All right. Thank you.